We are live now.
Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the second lecture of astronomy, astrophysics. So as I had told you earlier that this will be an introduction, and then after a brief introduction to the basically the basics of astronomy, we were talking about the physics ingredients of astrophysics, and there we started off with gravitation, and we'll continue on that. So we extensively did some problems related to body motion in a gravitational field. So today we will talk a little bit more about that, but then we will talk about the more systems which have more than two bodies and more like n-body systems. So basically a genuinely many-body problem. And that is definitely a more complicated one because there each body in there is affected by the gravitational force of the other body. So they are so it is more complicated to deal with that. But typically, we are used to dealing with this many body systems using statistical physics. However, these conventional ideas of statistical physics, it assumes that energy is extensive, which means that energy scales with size. So, however, if we because the thing is that if suppose we have a container of a gas consisting of molecules and we divide it into two parts, then the total energy will be sum of the internal energies of the two parts. That's what I mean. That okay, so it will always be remain the same. However, this idea does not work for if I consider a system which is also a many body system, but say it is like a star cluster, like where the bodies are really stars, which are about 10 to the 50 times heavier than each of the than the particles in your than the particles in the gas system that we typically deal with in the statistical mechanics problems, and or it could be a cluster of galaxies which are even larger. So now if we divide them into two parts, then we see so then what happens is that the total energy will not be the sum of two parts, because there will always be some gravitational interaction. Gravitational interaction we know is a long range interaction, and here we are considering particles or bodies which are really massive. So as the mass increases, the gravitational force increases. So in that sense of the word, basically the absolutely basically using the complete statistical physics nomenclature or the treatment doesn't work when we are treating with gravitating bodies. Now, and just to take this one step further, we should also like just to understand, because say when we are dealing with a gas consisting of molecules, and we separate it into two parts. Could you please mute yourself? And we are dealing with two parts. We have into two parts. Then there will still be interaction. There will be interaction only at the surface where they are in touch, because these interactions are short range, and one can see that basically that interaction, if the size of the length scale of the system is L, then that interaction, the surface interaction, will go as L square, whereas the volume of the object is L cube. So if L becomes very large, then for the systems which we typically deal with in statistical physics, is L square by L cube, that number becomes significantly small, as a result of which the interaction between the two parts of the two parts of the gas now with consisting of molecules is very small. So but however, this is not true if the gas particles are themselves very massive, like say stars or galaxies in a cluster. So the conventional assumptions of statistical mechanics need to be modified when gravity has to be taken into account. So this slide was mainly to impress upon you the fact that gravity works slightly differently because of its far-reaching effect. Now let's take a look at so suppose but however, in this many body problems in astrophysics, where the main interaction is gravitational, there is a beautiful result which is known as Biot theorem. And this Biot theorem it gives a relation between the total kinetic energy and the total potential energy of a system in equilibrium. So we will do that now. So let us consider the system consisting of many particles. So this is, you all are familiar with such systems. So here the particles have masses m1, m2. So ith particle has mass mi, and they are, so if you consider a common origin, these are their separations from the origin of coordinates, what you may. So these r1, r2 are their separations from a common origin, and each particle is moving with a velocity v1, v2 in random direction. So they can be in any direction. So having defined this system, we can always write down. So this is something you have done in classical mechanics. We can write the moment of inertia of the system about its origin, which will be the summation over mi ri square, summed over all particles. We can also write down the total gravitational potential energy once again in this form, and the kinetic energy. So these are sort of straightforward classical mechanics things that you all are familiar with. Now, the one thing we need to understand or define is the time derivative of this moment of inertia is called virial. So that's the whole thing. We will see why this is called a virial theorem. But the genesis of this is this time derivative q, which is half di dt, where I is the moment of inertia. And so if we write it down, write it in terms of MIRI, and then PI, then this Q is equal to summation over PI dot RI, where PI is the momentum of individual particles. So just a disclaimer, I will be saying particles, but they are actually, they could be stars or they could be galaxies. It's a cluster of particles, that's what I'm saying. So particles doesn't mean that they're very small or less massive. These are massive objects. So now if we take a double derivative of this, or basically a derivative of the virial itself, then what we get on the right hand side is something like this. So all of you have done it at some point, and we can then see that basically it consists of two terms, and then we can write this. And if you look at this, so this is a sum of the gravitational potential energy u plus twice the kinetic energy. So this is what the double derivative of the moment of inertia and or the time derivative of the virial, as you may say. So now let us look at, so if you look at the statement of the virial theorem, it gives you a relation between the total kinetic energy and the total potential energy when it is in equilibrium. Now what is equilibrium? So the equilibrium would mean, so now would mean that this double derivative of moment of inertia vanishes. So in steady state where this is 0, then obviously the right hand side 2k plus u will be equal to 0. So in that case, we see the total energy will be, so the total energy is obviously k plus u, which is the potential kinetic energy plus the potential energy. So one can write the total energy of the system as equal to minus the potential kinetic energy or half of the potential energy. However, it is not always that it is an imperfect steady state, but what often happens is that, see, these particles are all moving about. So it might be that they could be, as we saw that when they are in the gravitational field, they have orbits, and if those are regular periodic orbits, then they basically are oscillating. Then what one can show is that so that is a bound system. So which means that they have well-defined orbits, and what this then one can show that basically the virial quantity, it oscillates between definite values. And in that case, basically what one sees is that the time average of the kinetic energy, twice the time average of the kinetic energy plus the time average potential energy is equal to 0. So that is the general statement of virial theorem. So this is a very nice result. So you know that we are very good in writing out expressions for total potential energy and total kinetic energy. Now let's see how astronomers use it. So now let's consider, so this is actually extensively used to estimate masses of large groups of galaxies. And that's actually a fantastic thing. Like, if this is a simple enough result, which you can, like, it's a even not even one page, you know, all of you have probably gone through it at some point, but not written down the virial theorem, but this is what it is. So now let us consider a system which is a large group of galaxies in which there are n galaxies, capital N galaxies, each of mass mi. So now these are point masses. A point basically because compared to their separations, the sizes of these galaxies are small compared to that, but they themselves are big enough. But this is astronomy, so we talk about very large scales, and we can define their position vectors as ri, and they move with velocities vi. So now But so if this galaxy system is in equilibrium, then we can write down the BBL theorem, and then we can write. So then, as we saw, that the time average of the kinetic energy, twice of it, plus the time average of the potential energy is equal to 0. So if I just simply write down the expressions for kinetic energy and potential energy, this is what I get. This is, I think, straightforward. Like this is that this will be the gravitational potential energy. I think it will be clearly clear to all of you. And this is twice the kinetic energy, and all of it summed over all the basically all the galaxies that are there in this group. Now, so this is what we have. So this is what, say, from physics we have. But now astronomy obviously depends on what you can observe. So what is the information that we get from observations? So now, as you see that there are these velocities, and we should have some means of measuring the velocities. And if you recall, in yesterday's lecture, I did speak about the measurement of velocities using Doppler shift of frequencies of spectral lines, for which we know the frequencies in the laboratory field. So because even so, if you consider these galaxies like, say, particles in a gas that you are more familiar with, they're making some random motion. So sometimes they're coming towards us, or sometimes they're going away from us. So there will be a net dispersion, like there is a spread of velocities. But of course, we can only see that spread which is along the line of sight, because that is what will cause the dispersion Doppler shift. If it is moving, say, across the line of sight, then there is no component of the velocity which is along the line of sight, then I will not be able to measure it. But it's a probabilistic thing. Like, if you consider a volume volume consisting of many galaxies, so there will always be some which are coming towards you, some which are moving away from you, exactly away from you, or some making some angles. So it is, if you look at it like in the terminology of, say, of statistical mechanics, it's like an ensemble in which particles are moving about randomly. Here it may not be completely random, because they are under the influence of the gravitational field, or the smooth gravitational field created by all the other galaxies which are there in the system. So that is one thing we can measure. And the other thing is that, of course, we can see the galaxies on the sky. So, but obviously we have to understand that what we always see on the sky is a 2D projection. So I have a volume, it might be a sphere, like the group could be a sphere, but what I'm seeing on the sky is a projection. It's a 2D projection of all these Ri vectors, the position vectors. So if I consider, okay, this is the center of my group, and I start determining the positions of each of these galaxies, that what I'm doing is I am taking just a projection on the sky, 2D projection, whereas it might actually be somewhat more larger than what I'm measuring, because it might be inclined with respect to my line of sight. So this is a 2D projection. So this means that we do have some uncertainties in determining these two, but on the other hand, we can always think about the average scenario. So recall when we did kinetic theory of gases, when we determined what is the velocity, like we assume that, okay, there are equal number of atoms which are moving in X direction, Y direction, and Z direction. And so those are the basic things that we use. So we can apply the same thing here. These are because, as I said, that the galaxies for all practical purposes are like point masses, because they are separated by distances much larger than their sizes. So on an average, we can say that the velocity vi square, I can relate the velocity vi square to the line of sight velocity dispersion, which means that I have 1/3 of the galaxies moving towards me, 1/3 in the other two directions in the coordinate system. So vi square is equal to 3 sigma square. And the other thing is that if this takes into account some geometric considerations, because once again, I may have variously aligned like position vectors which are differently aligned relative to me. So if I take an average over the entire solid angle means so the extent of in the sky itself. So then I can write down the quantity on the left hand side is what I am measuring. So what I write when I write down is 1 over the average value of Ri Rj, that is represented, that gives me an expression for actually the actual position vectors, or the separations of the galaxies from any measure from any coordinate origin that I assume. So now I have found a way. So this is my this is basically the velocity that I will measure, and these are the projections that I will measure. So now the third thing I will also assume, let us assume that, okay, if all the galaxies, if the mass of all the galaxies is due to the stars, so then there must be a relation between the total emission, which we will call luminosity. We will define it. Luminosity is basically the total energy emitted by all those stars, and the mass which is in the galaxy. So if the mass is all due to the stars, then there will be so there is a sort of scaling or a constant by which these two should be related. So I can say that, okay, the mass to light ratio of all these galaxies. So for individual galaxies, I can write down mi is equal to gamma Li. So when I do that, so now so then I write down this gamma. So now I go do it in the reverse direction. So I can write down then gamma as 3 pi by 2g, and then summation on the top I'll have Li sigma I squared. Just notice that I have replaced the mi in this expression by Li by gamma Li. And similarly for the gravitational energy, I will have Li Lj and Ri Rj. So what now you notice that the right hand side of this expression, in the right hand side of this expression, I have two constants, pi and g, and I also have these luminosities which I measure. I have the velocity dispersions which I measure, and also I have the projections, the projections that I see on the projection of the projected distances on the sky. So now I have transformed this problem entirely to some things which I can measure. And so which means that if I am able to measure, so I can derive these gammas. And so if I do that, then I will be able to derive. So I can, if I measure the LIs and I derive the gamma from this relationship, then I know the mass of the group of galaxies. So this is a very, I would say, a very neat way of finding out the mass of some object, a very huge collection of objects which are very far away from us. And it's a very direct application of some basic principles that we learn when we consider a system of particles. Okay. So, yes.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, there were a couple of questions.
I will not take questions now. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, so I think I will say the next one and then I'll break.
Okay.
So now we consider, so we now just move on a bit further. What we think is, now you consider, we try to see what we get using the Virial theorem for gaseous systems which are described by thermodynamics. What do we mean by that? So for systems for which we can describe, we can talk about the number density of particles, we can talk about the temperature and pressure. So these are the thermodynamic quantities, right? This is what you relate. Now the traditional way of looking into these things is that we consider this as a gas with f degrees of freedom and constant specific heat. So you may be surprised, but okay, this is right now. Let us consider that this is these are the thermodynamic systems that you are more used to. Then we will see how we modify it to apply it to gravitation, to astrophysical objects. So then these expressions for internal energy and the constant specific heat and the specific heat can be written in terms of the number of particles in the system and the degrees of freedom and and the temperature. So these are the two expressions that we have. Now, now for the first law of thermodynamics, we know that dq is equal to this is the differential form. So we have the dunt plus pd with the work done, and so we can write it out in terms of the specific heat, the vdp. So this is the standard form. This is just to work around the terms a bit. Okay, so we can then also, we know that the constant specific heat at constant pressure can be written as Cv plus Kb. So that's what we have, and then obviously we are aware of the adiabatic. We are aware of the adiabatic exponent, and so we can write that as a ratio of Cp by Cv, and so this is what the gamma will be. So these are all sort of familiar terms that you have done in thermodynamics, maybe in your first or second semester of BSc. Okay, and the internal energy then can be written in terms of the gamma and the number of particles in the system and the temperature, and Kb is the Boltzmann constant. Now, so we can then do a bit more of algebra. and write this as, so finally we write this as u int as gamma to gamma minus 1, 1 over gamma minus 1 into Pd. And so that P, and we can then write P as gamma minus 1 into epsilon, where we define epsilon to be the energy per unit volume. So U int by V is the quantity epsilon. So that is, so these are in terms of the, so these are the definitions that we use. So then now we will see what comes out of it. So, however, in such a system, we would also have, so this is a fluid, like it's a ball of gas. There will also be some, could also be some pressure gradients, and in astrophysical context, these pressure gradients are also important. So, whenever you have a pressure gradient, there will be some force due to it. So, when we are considering, say, the virial theorem, we have to consider that, because what we did in the virial theorem was we were deriving a relation between the kinetic energy and the potential energy, and in the first case, we just took the gravitational potential due to the interaction between the particles. But now if we consider that this, okay, this is a fluid, it's a ball of gas of, so say for, it's like a star, say, so then, but then it is then it's a fluid ball, and then it also has some pressure gradient. So when we write down the expression for that, for the virial theorem, we also have to include that. So what do we do? So, but now what we realize is that when we have such a such pressure gradients, the virial will actually pick up an additional contribution due to these pressure gradients from the force, and that we can write it out as, so if we write down that force as Ri dot Fi, so this is the contribution that the virial will pick up, and this force will be the gradient, pressure gradient. And if we do a bit of algebra, we get this, and finally we have an expression where this is the divergence of this RIP and plus 3P. This is the expression. So now what we notice is that, so now we have been, so far we have been writing down the expressions for the virial theorem by considering summation over the all the particles in the system. So now that summation over all the particles is also equivalent to an integration over the volume, right? So if we do that, so if we do consider that, so this then consider the first term, so that will be a volume integral over this volume integral of this, and that we can write as a surface integral, right? So this summation over all particles is equivalent to integration over entire volume, and then we can, this particular for the first term is basically a surface integral over a surface, and then we can consider that surface pressure to be constant. And if we do that, then that integral will give us an expression which is like minus 3ps times v. So when we write down, so just this is, so these two terms have contributions from the due to the pressure gradient, the first of which becomes minus 3ps times v. So now moving on, so, and the second term, basically what we could do is, we have written P in terms of gamma minus 1 times epsilon. So we can just write it in terms of the energy per unit volume and then integrate. So then if we integrate that, so now what was the, so this, since epsilon was the energy per unit volume, when we integrate it over the entire volume, we get the internal energy. So this term becomes minus 3ps times v, and this term will actually become the, so it will become the yeah, so then this will become 3 times unt. So we will have some form like this. So well, gamma minus 1 unt, 3 times gamma minus 1 unt. So this is what we see here. So now I write down the virial theorem for the system. So I still have this half d2i dt square, which becomes 0 if it is in equilibrium. Then I have the kinetic energy, then I have the gravitational potential energy, and then I have the two terms which arose because now I am considering a gaseous system for which I am considering the thermodynamic properties. Just to point out that this K that I write here, the first term, it includes the kinetic energy due to the bulk motion. So which means that the whole thing is moving, but then on top of that there is a random motion and thermal motion due to, and that is included in uint. So this is the whole expression for the virial theorem of the system. So now let us look at what happens if we apply to an ideal monoatomic gas with no bulk motion and it is in steady state. So steady state means it is the double derivative also, this left hand side becomes 0. There is no bulk motion, so K is equal to 0. It's an ideal monoatomic gas, so gamma is equal to 5/3. So we will end up, and the internal energy can be written as 3/2 kBT. So this is a sort of system we are all more or less familiar with. So if we do that, then the Beagle theorem would give us the, so what are these terms? These are the only terms which will remain. We will have the gravitational potential energy plus 3 times kB times T, where T is the temperature, and that will be equal to the surface pressure times the volume and 3 times of that. Okay. So now, if we now consider that what is the volume? So if we consider that we actually have a fluid mass of which is a sphere, a fluid sphere, which has a mass of m, radius r, and temperature T in equilibrium with the gravity balanced by pressure. Then the gravitational energy can be written as minus alpha times gm square by r, where alpha is something of the order of 1. So we can, broadly speaking, we can say that it's gm square by r. And so, and the other thing which you are quite familiar with, the one-dimensional velocity dispersion, which is basically a statement of the ideal gas law, as we will see. So and also the one-dimensional velocity dispersion can be written as u square equal to kBT by m. So this comes from by equating the you equate the thermal energy with the kinetic energy of the system. So if we do that, then, and so we now substitute the UGR equal to this minus alpha gm square by r, and we also put kBT is equal to mu square. So if we do this business, and also if we just replace the volume V by the mass itself, so V by 4 pi, V is equal V into 4 pi by 3 r cube is equal to m. So then we have an expression for the surface temperature, surface pressure, which looks like 1 over 4 pi, and in brackets we have 3 mu square, where u square is the one-dimensional velocity dispersion, r cube is the size of the radius of the sphere, and minus alpha gm square by r to the power 4, and alpha is some constant which is of the order of 1, some factor which is of the order of 1. Okay, so now so we come up with all these things. Now, if we do not have gravity, so which means that this term doesn't exist. So then what we will have is that, so this 3 by 4 pi, 3m by 4 pi r cube, that becomes our volume. Sorry, yeah. So then this 4 pi by 3 r cube becomes volume. So if we take it to that side, so we will not have this term, so we will just have this, and this is the ideal gas law, like this. Basically the PV is equal to KT, means some constant times KT. So this mu square is representative of that. So u square is related to the kinetic energy, and that is related to the thermal energy. However, if gravitation is present, then so in the presence of gravity, what happens is that because there is a mass enclosed, the cloud tends to collapse, and this is called due to its self-gravity. So if everything is being pulled towards the center, and so what happens is that, so this is a positive term, which means that this PS decreases as m goes up. So here you see that m has a square dependence. So if you increase m, this actually increases faster than this one. So that the pressure, surface pressure, decreases as the mass goes up. So now we may hit a situation where the surface pressure would become equal to 0. So what happens if the surface pressure becomes 0? Then it can no longer hold on to itself and it collapses, right? The concept of having a surface is that you have equal pressure on either side. So if the surrounding pressure is greater than the surface pressure, then the sphere will just collapse, and that is exactly the criterion we would get for. So which means that we can identify a mass for which such a thing will happen, for which such a spherical cloud will collapse under its own gravity, and that mass is called the critical mass. And that goes as 3 by alpha kb times the temperature, the radius, and the mass of the particles which constitute the total gas, and then this is the gravitational constant. And this mass is called Jeans mass. So what does it mean? It means that if we have, say, a volume of gas, and if somehow its mass exceeds a certain quantity, then it starts to collapse on its own. And this means that this is how, if you consider, okay, so we have a vast expanse of the space or interstellar medium, whatever the matter between the stars, how do the stars come into being? So it must be that at some place suddenly there is a collapse of the gas that is maybe otherwise a bit more extended to form more dense structures. And so this formation of any structure requires some kind of gravitational collapse, and this is one of the conditions which tells you that if the mass of a particular say a surface or a fluid sphere becomes larger than a certain quantity, it has to collapse, which means that that part of the cloud sort of segregates away, and it's called fragmentation of the cloud, and this mass is known as Jeans mass. And so this is a very crucial ingredient to understand the structure formation, and so because this gives us a mass for a cloud at a particular temperature, and tells us that it will collapse if its mass exceeds this collapse under self-gravity, if its mass exceeds the critical mass. So I should also say that there could be other pressure mechanisms which could be supporting the cloud against self-gravity, but I will not go into the details of that. The way they are incorporated is also by considering those pressure terms into the expression for the derivative of the virial, and then getting a revised estimate of the critical mass. So understanding this critical mass is the key to understanding both formation of stars and even that of galaxies, or for that matter, any structure formation. So I will pause now and take questions on both the problems that I described.
Okay, ma'am. So the first question is, sorry, what is velocity dispersion, and why are we considering the square of velocities or velocity dispersion?
So I would say, so you are aware of, that's why I refer to the kinetic theory of gases. It is actually difficult to derive everything for you. So if you consider, say, if you have heard of the term RMS velocities, right? You have, so when you have, say you are aware that when you have a gas, the velocity is distributed in equilibrium. Say if it's a gas in equilibrium, the velocity is distributed according to Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, which means that not all particles in there have the same velocity, but there is a distribution. So the dispersion means that, so if you consider that there is a mean velocity, and then the individual gas molecules will have slightly different velocities relative to the mean velocity, and that is the dispersion about the mean. That's what is referred to, because that is a quantity we know. And then why is it square? So once again you go back, so this is the root mean square velocity, which you will see. So you consider a vector, and if you split it up into three components, then the sum of the individual components, you do it in quadrature, and then that is what gives you the total the total magnitude of the vector. So that's why this is considered in square. And secondly, the velocity square is important because that is what contributes to kinetic energy. Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The next question is, when we are considering a cluster of particles for a large body like star, aren't we essentially dealing with continuous medium? And
No.
how does the virial theory
No, so
translate?
that's why I mentioned that these are we can still consider them as point masses, because there is nothing in between the stars. Whatever is there in between the stars has the mass content is much less. So in principle, and also the separation between the stars or the galaxies is much larger than their sizes. So there is the matter in between, there is nothing. So it's not a continuous thing. The star itself is a continuous thing, as you will see that it's a sphere, ball of gas. But if we consider between two stars, there is hardly any matter in between. If you make an estimate of there is interstellar medium, but the matter content is mass content is much less. So it's not a continuous medium. It's more clearly more like say an ideal gas, or a gas system where you have particles.
Okay, so the next is, I mean, this is related to Jeans mass. Uh, is so below Jeans mass, is there no collapse? And the similar question: what is M? What happens when M is equal to M critical?
Yeah. So as I said, so below Jeans mass, there is no collapse. So the thing is that at that in that case, what you see is that the pressure of the because the force that is generated due to the pressure gradient within the fluid is able to counter the gravitational force. That's why there is no collapse. But once that the gravitational force becomes larger by way of increase in the mass, then the collapse cannot be stopped. So there are various, as I said, the support can be due to various things. As you will see in the case of, say, stars, there is hydrostatic equilibrium, which is the gas pressure which holds it. So there are different ways, as I said, support mechanisms. So below Jeans mass, there is no collapse. But and I also mentioned, so above Jeans mass, what happens is that it starts to collapse, which means that if you consider, say, I have a sort of I have a say a cuboid, or a cuboid which is a gas, which is filled with gas, and then in some part of the cuboid, there is suddenly an increase. There is a condition, say suddenly some part of it cools down. So what will happen in that case? So let's take that case. So if suddenly this temperature becomes lower, which means that the critical mass for that part will become lower, which means that if I have, even for a smaller mass, that part will start to collapse. But that part is only collapsing, the rest of it is not collapsing, which means that it will sort of break out of that cloud. So that is called fragmentation, and that is one of the key mechanisms for forming stars. That's how star would form, because if you consider the formation of stars, the material between the stars has densities which go up to, or maybe the material from which they form, there may be of the order of 10 to the power 100 to 1000 grams per cc, whereas the stars, as you saw, are very are like huge orders of magnitude denser. So that is so the main thing what that happens is that the cloud fragments, and then it starts to collapse, the part which fragmented out, because the critical mass is lower than its mass already. So then it starts to collapse till that equilibrium is reached again. That's so it will be a runaway collapse, but there are various mechanisms which can support the cloud against such a collapse.
Uh, there are two rather general questions.
Yes.
One of them is, what is the physical significance of Periel theorem?
Okay. So I think I will write it down. That is it's
Okay.
better explained. I tried to explain it in the lecture, but I think maybe something written will help. Yeah. So it
Yeah.
actually gives a relationship between the total kinetic energy. It's a beautiful theorem. You appreciate that. It gives the relation between kinetic energy and potential energy of the system, and that helps us to understand various physical phenomena much better. Yeah. And what else?
Another one was, if there is no velocity of the star along the line of sight, then is there any method how to calculate the velocity?
No, so it is difficult. So, but typically, say if this is we are dealing with a cluster of stars, so there will always be some star which will be moving, and also the thing is that when we are dealing with a cluster of stars, they are actually moving in a sort of uniform gravitational potential that is created by all the other stars in the cluster. So there is some predictability in the way these stars will move. Since this is sort of more involved, so like these dense cluster systems are studied, the dynamics of them are studied. This is somewhat beyond the scope of this lecture. I will restrict my answer to this. Okay. So I think I will carry on now, Pritesh. Okay.
Okay.
So rest of the questions I will answer on. I have, like for the last lecture, I have answered most of the questions which I thought could be answered on Moodle, and that has also been shared with the YouTube participants. So I will do the same for this lecture as well. Okay. So now let's look into another concept, which is so we are now looking into these many body systems. So now let us consider that we have a container of gas. So we are very familiar with these things. That's why I'm starting with them. So now, if, as I say that maybe, so these are gas at normal temperature and pressure, and what we know is that the velocity of, then in equilibrium, the velocity of the particles or the gas molecules or atoms, whatever you may want, they are Maxwellian. So, and so typically they obey this universal law. It's a Maxwellian velocity distribution. Suppose what we do is we do something to make the velocity distribution non-Maxwellian by changing some things and make it very different from Maxwellian, and then we let the system be. What we will see is that after a certain time, they will once again become Maxwellian. Now, how does that happen? We know that in such a system, basically the atoms and molecules in the gas are colliding against each other, and these collisions are very frequent. And you know of the term mean free path, which means the basically what is on an average the distance that a particle gets to travel before it has a collision. And so you are aware of this, and what we know is that a particle, since a particle undergoes many collisions, that is because the mean free path is much smaller than the characteristic size of the system. So which is to say that if, say, the mean free path were much larger, then the particle would had a very high probability of escaping the system without ever colliding with any of the other particles in the system. But that is not true for the gas systems that we are familiar with. So this is but however, for a gravitating system, which means that where we have objects which are massive, like not like the atoms and molecules, but they are like system of stars. What happens is that the probability of an actual physical collision between two stars happening between two stars is very low. So typically a star would be moving. So as I said, you can consider, if you consider a cluster of stars, a star is actually moving in the smooth gravitational field produced by all the other stars. And when so the direct collision, probability of direct collision, if you do a calculation with the separation between average separation between the stars, etc., you'll see that that is very low. But however, what happens is that when the two stars are close enough, like there is we can define something called the impact parameter, and when they're sufficiently close to each other, then their trajectories will be deflected. So in the astrophysical terminology, that itself is a collision. So it's not a head-on collision, that there's no way that will happen, but mostly, so basically they're just some deflection from their trajectories due to the mutual gravitational interaction is what we would call a collision. So now in a stellar system, what happens is that such encounters keep happening, and then because of that, there will be changes in velocities of those systems. And so, and these interactions are the ones which play the role of what is called play the role of collisions, and they will ultimately relax the system. So relaxing the system is, as I mentioned for the first case, that if you let the system be, it will finally always come with a velocity distribution of a Maxwellian velocity distribution, that is for a system consisting of gas molecules. But so it means that if you let the system be, then that final configuration that it comes to is its relaxed state. However, as we saw, this for the self-gravitating system, since there is no head-on collision, the energy exchange per gravitational scattering is very low. So it's a very slow process. So we will see that it probably cannot relax the system in contrast to the molecular scattering in a normal gas. So now let us consider a gravitational encounter between two bodies in an in-body system, say a cluster of stars once again, and each of mass m and relative velocity v. So this is what we would call to be basically a collision, in the sense that suppose this particle this star was moving with a velocity along this straight line, then due to the gravitational potential of another star, it undergoes this kind of a deflection. So deflection of trajectory of a star involves change in momentum, which is, so we will finally define a collision to be that event for which the total deflection of trajectory of the star or its change of momentum is as large as the original momentum of the star. And in this context, we can also define a time which is called a relaxation time. So it means that, so as I said, that for the stars, what happens is that this single collision leading to such a change in momentum doesn't happen. So all these small deviations in velocities that occur due to these due to these gravitational interactions, so they sort of slowly change the momentum of a particular star, so that finally when the all these deviations added up together, when they equal to the when they are equal to the initial velocity of the star, so the time that it takes to get to that state, that is called the relaxation time. Okay, so now now let us do some, once again, some estimates, some very order of magnitude estimates. So now if we have two stars which have masses small m, so at collision, when the collision, so I'm calling this collision, it's an interaction, gravitational interaction happens, the force between the two stars will be gm square by d square. So if d is, so if this is, say, the where the other star is, so this is the distance between, the minimum distance between the two stars, and so then the force between them will be gm square by d square. And how long does this force act on the star which is coming in? The time of interaction will be of the order of the distance between the two and the velocity with which the star is moving. You can calculate that. That is not very, so it will be of the order of d by v. Now, so this interaction will introduce induce a transverse velocity, which we can write as, so this is like an impulse which is happening. So you have this force acting for this time. So what kind of velocity change in momentum will happen due to that? So you can write that down as in terms of the transverse velocity. And so then the delta Vt is equal to Gm over dv. So that's the transverse velocity which is induced by this interaction. So, and as I said, I will consider it to be a collision only when this delta Vt is of the order of v, or delta Vt by v is of the order of 1. And that gives me a value of for this b, which is or a critical value for b, so that b has to be less than this bc, which is the critical value of the impact parameter, and that is of the order of gm over v square, where v is the velocity with which the star is moving and m is its velocity. Okay, so and also we know, so what is the effective collision cross section for the or cross section for this collision? So it will be square of the distance. So it is, you can consider a sort of a sphere around this, so the surface area of this. So this sigma, this is a cross section. So it will go as bc square. So that is, and we can write that down in terms of the expression for bc that we wrote. So bc square is equal to g square m square by d to the power 4. And finally, so now we can say that, now what are we trying to calculate? We are trying to see that after how much time will this delta Vt by v be of the order of 1. So now if we recall how you have solved problems in, say, for knowing the mean free path, or knowing the number of particles and the collisional cross section and the velocity, so you actually estimate how many collisions are going to happen per unit time, and then you take an inverse of it. That tells you that, okay, there is the possibility of having one collision is so one collision will take on an average this much of time. So, and that is what I said is the collisional relaxation time. Relaxation time, I define that, I will call it the time that it takes the delta Vt's to sort of add up to the value v. So this collisional relaxation time scale then is 1 over n, which is the number of stars which are in the system, number density of stars in the system per unit volume. Then sigma is the collision cross section, and v is the velocity with which a star moves. And if I substitute the value of sigma and v in here, I will get an expression which looks something like this. So now where n is the total number of particles or number of stars that I have in the system. So it is n r cube. R cube is the total size of the system. V cube is the velocity cube, and g square over m square. M is the mass of the total cluster. So we are considering the relaxation of a cluster of stars which has n stars and has an if you consider it to be a spherical volume, as a radius of r and a total mass of n. So if we go back to the statement of Virial theorem, then if we consider that, okay, so what do we need? We would have twice the kinetic energy equal to the gravitational potential energy. So if the system is virialized, then we can write this thing down, and then finally we will have a collisional relaxation time of the order of n into r by v. And so this means that the relaxation time scale is n times the crossing time. So crossing time means what? So this is the length scale. R is the length scale. So it is the radius of the say sphere, if you want. and v is the velocity with which a star is moving. So r by v is the time it takes for the star to say go from the center to leave the system. So that is the crossing time. So the relaxation time is the number of particles times the crossing time of an individual particle for this crossing time for the entire source cluster. So now if we do some, so now what we see is that for most gravitational systems, what we will see is that this r over v, the crossing time, is comparable to dynamical time scale. So dynamical time scale means the time scale over which any mechanical changes happen in the system. So for large n, since if you look at this, so for large n, this TGC also becomes large, and then it is much larger. So if this is of the order of dynamical time scale and n becomes too large, then this TGC is much larger than the dynamical time scale. So for a galaxy which has 10 to the power 11 stars, and the average velocity of the stars is about 300 kilometers per second, and the size of the galaxy is about 10 kiloparsecs, then we can see that this the relaxation time scale is of the order of 3 times 10 to the 18 years. Now compare this with the age of the universe, which is about 10 to the 10 years. So it's definitely a very large time. The relaxation time is much larger than this age of the universe. So does this mean that the stellar velocity distribution of all stars is completely unrelaxed? Well, not really, because what we had said is that we do not consider basically we will not consider the single impacts, and so there are a large, when we did the analysis, we considered interaction between only 2 stars, but there are large number of stars, and it is the total mean square transverse velocity due to all the stars. And taking all of this into account, we can see that we can write down the change in square of the average change in the square of the transverse velocity in terms of to be of the order of v, will become of the order of v square, and when the relaxation time is of the order of the TGC that we calculated here divided by 8 times the logarithmic of n, log normal of n. And so this is a much smaller time, and this is why the system is actually, so you could calculate it out for the system that I have described here, and then see what numbers you get. So essentially, but there are other considerations in the sense that the galaxy could be also there could be sudden violent phenomena which are equivalent to very large like collisions, which could lead to violent relaxation, in the means that it means that it sort of leads to larger interaction between the stars, and so typically shortens this time scale so that the system relaxes easily. So I have you can calculate this relaxation time scale, say for globular clusters with about millions stars, and velocity is much smaller, like 10 kilometers per second, and the size is between 3 to 100 per sec, and then you can see what numbers you get. This is I could leave it as a homework. Okay, so we finished. I think I won't have time to stop now. I will take the questions at the end. So let's just talk about a bit about. So we have finished what. So I have finished whatever I wanted to tell you about the gravitation application of basic many gravitation problems for astrophysical objects. Now let us take a look at the matter which constitutes these astrophysical objects. So as I said, that there is a large range of temperature and density, which means that the constituents of these astrophysical objects would exist in different physical states with varied properties. And but one of the things, as I think I had mentioned in this lecture, that one of the typical ways to deal with any system or any matter is to talk about its equation of state, which gives you a relation of between the pressure of the system to its temperature and density. So yeah, so let's just go ahead. So it's a standard tool, and now there are many gases which are encountered in astrophysics which obey the ideal gas law, which means that basically the interparticle distance is much larger than the size of the object, or so this ideal gas law, or maybe it's equivalent, and they often, as I say, they will also obey this Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. So that is a very standard thing, particularly in the interiors of stars, normal stars. I've written non-degenerate because it will immediately be clear what I mean by degenerate. So the gases are mostly ionized, and so mostly ionized. So to a first order, basically, you can consider although we consider the inside interiors of the stars to be ideal gases, but the thing is that since the gases are mostly ionized at such high temperatures, there will be some electrostatic force between the particles, and that constitutes about 10% of the potential energy of the so potential energies of 10% of the considered about 10% of the kinetic energy. Its potential energy will be equal to 10% of the kinetic energy. And so ideal gas flow is a sort of satisfactory approximation for use in understanding the broad properties of stellar interiors, which will be done in detail to some extent in the tutorials. And then however, the detailed models must take into account the electrostatic potential energy. So, but then this ideal gas flow works fairly well for many systems. However, we next come to the state where if, so now for in the ideal gas, like in that scenario, if we consider these particles or the constituents to be classical particles, then when we go to very low temperatures, this momentum and energy will vanish. Low temperatures or even at high density. So the two are analogous. So if we have, so either you consider low temperatures or you could consider very low densities. But so if you have a situation when the densities are very high, then this, as I said, the interiors of the stars are actually ionized. So you actually have ions and electrons. But if you have the density, if the densities become too high, then we are in the quantum regime. In the sense that in that case, we have to treat the system composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons, all of which are fermions. We have to treat them quantum mechanically. And how does that change the whole thing? So the issue is that we know that based on this Fermi statistics. So if you consider these are fermionic matter, the electron, proton, etc., they are fermionic matter. So if we want to so if we consider the electron gas, so if we want to now if they, but so they when they are so when they are in the high density situation, they are only allowed to occupy the or fill up the available energy levels in a certain way, following the Pauli exclusion principle, which means that no two identical electrons will be allowed to fill up the energy level. So as a result of which, even at very low temperatures or corresponding to very high densities, all the lowest quantum energy states are filled, such that the addition of so that it is no longer possible to add more particles or to reduce the volume without increasing the energy of the system. So then, which means that there is some kind of resistance to sort of collapsing the object. So if you have, we have been talking about pressure, which will hold an object against a gravitational collapse. But now, if we are also here, we see that we have packed the whole thing in a way that so that the objects, so that the matter inside is now we have to treat it as a Fermi gas, and as a result of which and it is a degenerate matter in the sense, so that all the lower energy levels, quantum energy states, are filled up, so that anything we want to add to it is resisted. So there is a pressure which is, we can interpret this as a pressure which is created due to the degeneracy of the gas, and that's called the degeneracy pressure, and that is independent of the temperature of the thing. So even when the temperature is very low, because of the quantum nature of the system, we will have this pressure existing. And such situation arises inside the very compact stars, which are known as white dwarfs or neutron stars. And I will talk more about them when I discuss the evolution of stellar evolution, because these are both in states of evolution of low and high mass stars, and so the matter becomes degenerate. And so now it's a very different thing. So when we were considering, say, non-degenerate matter, we were considering pressure, and we were considering that it follows the ideal gas law, that because then we could write down the pressure in a certain way. But now this, even at very low temperatures, because of the high density and the quantum nature of the thing, we have an additional pressure, and that is called and that varies very differently. It depends on, doesn't depend on the density. So it varies just by the size and the temperature. So it is it is independent of the temperature when it becomes perfectly degenerate. And so however, there is no it is not an ideal gas, but there is no interparticle force. It's called a perfect gas. So the equation of state, when one writes down, one takes care of that. So I won't go into the details of that. And in such a situation, the speeds of the particle, which we were earlier considering are described by the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, are described by the Fermi-Dirac or the Bose-Einstein distribution as depending on the spin of the particles. And this reduces which will reduce to the classical Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution when the temperatures are sufficiently high or densities become lower. So this is the degenerate gas, and degenerate electron. However, we can also have situations where this degenerate electron gas can be relativistic or non-relativistic, and they would correspond to different equations of states. And finally, we could also have a situation where we have a ball of photons. It's radiation that we have. So radiation itself, we could have so if we consider that we have a gas of photons which is in thermal equilibrium with the walls of the container. So you're familiar with this concept when you studied about the blackbody radiation. So we could have a situation so it is in equilibrium with the photons could be in equilibrium with the walls of the container, and in the astrophysical scenario it is in equilibrium with the particles which is emitted. And in that case, the momenta of the photons, they follow the blackbody distribution rather than the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, and the pressure will depend only on the temperature. That anyway is a characteristic of the blackbody distribution, and it is independent of the density. So the equation of state for such a photon gas will be given by P equal to A T to the power 4 by 3. So that is a completely different. So here, as I say, that the idea is to get some kind of relation of between the pressure and temperature and density, or temperature, whatever may be important. So this photon gas is actually very different from, say, classical particulate gas, because the number of photons is not conserved. So consider a volume of gas in an astrophysical object. The radiation is actually continuously leaving the system and entering the system. So if there is an increase in temperature, then there is creation of additional photons. So number of photons is not conserved. In contrast to, say, the number of, if you consider, say, a star, it's not that it is losing a lot of, unless it is losing mass, the matter content remains the same. But when you are talking of the photons, it is slightly different. So one has to take all of these things into account, and that is typically done when one is considering the radiative processes. So basically, this photon gas has the capability of absorbing a large amount of gas for a large amount of energy for a given temperature rise. So I think I will stop here today, and tomorrow we will talk about the radiative processes that are seen in the astrophysical objects. Okay, so I think we'll have some quick questions.
Yes, ma'am. So one of the questions is, we are observing macroscopic systems like cluster of galaxies using thermodynamics. What kind of systems are we considering? Closed, open, or isolated?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in principle they are sort of open systems, but if you consider, so now when we talk about the clusters, they are actually bound by some attraction, by some interaction, so gravitationally bound. So for all practical purposes, they can be approximated as closed systems. But as I said it is not fully closed in the sense that there is always energy energy leaving the system. So all of these things, so that's what complicates the thing. But what is astounding, I would say, is that even by making very simplistic approximations, it is possible to not only interpret a lot of the observed numbers but also predict things. So that is where astrophysics, I think that's what makes astrophysics very different from any other discipline, because obviously the enormity of the size and the range of densities makes it very difficult to sort of have a very well defined say equations of motion, or even say the various thermodynamic equations. But then by making suitable approximations, and one has to always keep in mind that some of these approximations, as I say, that even though they are galaxies, but if you consider a cluster of galaxies, you should consider how far is the other galaxy. So it is the intergalactic distance which is much larger than the size. So then these approximations are actually good, and it also brings out the sort of strength of these approximations when they're applied to the classical systems that we are more used to.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, what does collapse mean for different objects, like let's say stars and galaxies?
So collapse means that it is a reduction of size with time. What exactly is the question? I do not understand.
I think the question is like stars we are considering made up of like particles and atoms, etc. And galaxies are made up of stars. So I think
yeah.
she wants to ask that.
Yeah, so I do not I don't know whether what I'm my response will be satisfactory. So the thing is that collapse means that increase in density. So if you consider, so when I went through the sort of types of densities that we see in the universe, it's a huge range. So basic, but so the overall the densities are very low, but then you have certain like higher density structures. So those are what we call structures. So we have these galaxies, and then within the galaxies we have the stars. So how these came about is a very different issue. So then the stars themselves form from the interstellar medium. So but the interstellar medium itself is not so dense. So when we say collapse, we actually mean also that enhancement of density for the stars, as we will see. So when they evolve beyond a certain point, they collapse, and then they become so either they explode. So then basically the collapse in this case means that when the gravity takes over, so it will just it will collapse, and then in some cases you have a singularity which is formed. So that's a black hole. That's what it overall, that's what it means, that change of rate of change of say, I would say linear scale, linear size or size with time. That's it.
Um, can we take one more question,
Yes.
or should we
Yeah,
stop?
let's take one more question and then.
Okay. Okay. Why is the change in momentum greater than one? In one of the slides, you had
Yeah.
said
So
this.
that is a
I
matter
think.
of definition. So when you what
Okay.
happens when you have a head-on collision? So you just consider a completely elastic collision. What is the change of momentum? If two particles are moving with the same momentum, say mv, and they collide, what is the net change of momentum? It is of the order of the momentum itself, like the individual momentum. So the you so that is our definition of a collision. So it's a significance of it. So like if it is a small change, we do not the effect is not perceptible. So we will call it it's a definition. That's why. So the characteristic collision requires that the momentum changes by a significant amount, and that is a limit, that if it is greater than or equal to the original momentum, so then that is. So you have momentum transfer in the normal collision. So it's just that concept, extending that concept. Yes, maybe one
Okay,
more
ma'am.
short question if there is.
Uh,
Otherwise, people
I
have
think.
written down the questions, so we can answer. I will answer whichever.
Yeah. I think we can stop now
Okay,
because
okay,
there
okay.
are
Then
like
yeah.
elaborative questions. So,
Okay, okay, okay. Then
okay. Thank you,
okay.
ma'am.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll stop sharing, and thank you all.
Students, you can